Turn it on. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second week of the Deschooling course. And this week, what I'm going to be talking about is fitting unschooling to the legal framework. Now, I think I mentioned last week, I'm actually in New South Wales. And so New South Wales is the state that I know most about the legal framework, but I know enough about the situation Australia-wide to know that there is very similar legislation in each state. There are slight variations, but there are similar requirements. So I'm going to be talking generally about unschooling and also a bit about the specific situation in New South Wales. But I think you'll find that most of the information will be relevant to everybody. So I'm going to start out just by talking a bit about my story in relation to registration, because it was a bit of an interesting journey. When I started out with the home education in 2006, I hadn't actually sent my eldest son. He was actually, I started when he was 5. I sort of got the idea that I was going to homeschool him. And he hadn't been to school. So he wasn't on any school records or anything like that. And as I thought, well, I'm going to be probably unschooling, almost certainly, given how he was, which I described last week, I basically didn't register for, with the government authority. And I was fortunate to meet quite a few people in our local community, some of whom were registered and some of whom weren't. So there were enough people around who also weren't registered that I thought, okay, I'm not completely out on a limb here. There are other people who are doing it and it's sort of okay. And I really couldn't get my head around the whole registration thing for years. It really scared me because I had these 2 sons who were just playing and playing and playing and playing video games and playing with Lego and playing with their friends and playing with each other, but they were not the slightest bit interested in any sort of formal bookwork or sitting down or learning to read or write or any of those things in any sort of school-like way. So I went for years thinking it's just going to be impossible. I don't know how I could ever get registered. I think it would be just way, way too hard. So I just completely avoided the issue and we just sailed on. So it got to about, well, when my eldest was 9, and by that stage we were pretty in the groove with unschooling. Like we'd been doing it for years and we were having a pretty good time. I'd sort of settled into the unschooling lifestyle and I was enjoying, being with the boys and playing with them, and we'd made friends in our local community, some of whom were also unschooling. So we had a bit of a local group of unschoolers, which was really, really nice. So we were pretty happy just doing our own thing. But I did have increasing concerns that we might get caught, because we caught by the truancy officers that, hang around public places, because we spent a lot of our time in playgrounds and public parks and shopping centres, and, we were wandering around the place all the time. Well, when we were out, when we were at home, obviously, the kids were doing all sorts of things, but things sort of came to a head as I became sort of nervous about this. One of my close friends who was also unschooling her 2 sons, who were friends with my boys, she actually got caught by the truancy police. in a shopping centre in the middle of the day, looking, you know, they were out looking at Lego in Kmart or something, and the police approached them, an truancy officer. And this had been my fear, you know, that this might happen, and it happened to my close friend. So the upshot of that was she had to register. I mean, they said, why aren't you registered? And she said, oh, I don't know. You know, she sort of bluffed her way through that conversation. But the upshot of it was that she was required to register because they had her name and address and all that sort of stuff. Anyway, she basically put her head down and did all the work involved in getting registered. She had the homeschool inspector come, and she was fine. They said, yep, this is all good. You've done a great job. You've got 2 years registration. And off you went. So that was enormously encouraging to me. And I thought, okay, basically my kids are doing exactly what her kids are doing, because they're playing with each other online most days. They're playing in parks together, all this sort of stuff. So if she can get registered, so can I. So I went then through the process of preparing for registration and following her lead, doing all this documentation of what my kids were actually doing. And I voluntarily, you know, applied. I didn't wait till I was caught. I applied to get registered, and it went fine. And so that was when my eldest was 9, and he was registered repeatedly until he was 17, when, of course, you don't have to be registered anymore. So I went through a lot of re-registrations in that period, and developed quite an expertise in how to actually how to get this unschooling lifestyle into the legal framework. And this friend of mine and myself, we actually helped a lot of other families who wanted to get registered or re-registered and be unschoolers as well. So we worked with quite a lot of people in our community to help them, and there was a lot of success. Basically everybody who applied got the full amount of registration and had no problems. And yeah, that was a really empowering thing for me to realize we could actually just keep on doing what we were doing, as long as I was willing to basically translate what we were doing into the educational language, and provide this documentation to demonstrate what my children were actually learning. So that's the process that I'm going to describe to you today, is like how I did that. And this was, as I said, at a time when my kids were really just playing the whole time. So so the legal framework, it was actually quite important to me that I knew what my legal obligations were. Partly that's because I've got a legal background, and I like to sort of know where I stand. So I actually went and looked up the Education Act in New South Wales to find out exactly what my legal obligations were. And what it says in the Education Act is that parents must provide for the child to receive instruction that meets the minimum curriculum for schools. So parents have to provide for the child to be instructed in the minimum curriculum for schools. All right. Now, when I first read that, I kind of freaked out, because I thought, well, I'm not providing instruction and nobody's following the curriculum here. But I worked out how to, you know, how to get into that phrase. So the minimum curriculum is basically the same across Australia. You have to follow the 6 key learning areas. And you have to basically have a course of study in each of the 6 key learning areas. And some of the other words that leapt out of me out of the Education Act were that the courses must be appropriate for the children concerned, having regard to their level of achievement and needs. So you have to have a course that is appropriate for your child's level of achievement and their needs. And this was really important to me, because basically you have to adapt your educational program to the needs of your child. And that means the educational needs, the learning needs, and their personality needs, you know, all those aspects of the needs of the child come into it. So that gives you a lot of room to move, basically, adapting your program to the needs of your child. Also, in New South Wales, you can't get your registration cancelled if your child basically refuses to follow your educational program. There's a section in the Act that says you can't get cancelled because your child is disobedient. Now, you know, that's like a last resort fallback. If the worst comes to the worst, you just say, look, my child wouldn't do it. They were disobedient. And you can't get cancelled for that. But you have to get registered first before, you know, that even becomes an issue. So the question becomes then is, how can you show that your child is receiving this instruction and learning what's in the curriculum? So firstly, you can explain how you're adapting your teaching program to the needs of your child. And the question I ask myself when approaching this is, well, how does my child learn best? You know, what is their learning style? How do they really get into learning most effectively? And I found when applying for registration that it's great to have a few terms of educational jargon up your sleeve. So for example, I could say, because my children learned a lot through play and experiences and conversation, I could say they like to learn through experience. And I put that into like an educational term by saying they're experiential learners, which basically means they like to learn through experience rather than just being, you know, spoon-fed information or doing something in a workbook. So experiential learning is actually a legitimate educational, you know, approach that's used by schools and all sorts of people. So the other terms that you could use, you could say they like activity-based learning or project-based learning. Quite a lot of home educators use project-based learning. Some people call it unit studies, but your project could be doing the gardening and planting vegetables, or it could be playing a particular video game, or watching a series of Star Wars movies, or going to art classes, or any of those sort of things. So project-based learning encompasses more of this learning through experience and hands-on sort of stuff. I also use the term conversational learning a lot, because that's essentially what was happening in my home most of the time. We were talking about stuff, you know, my kids would be playing, I'd be playing with them, we'd be driving in the car or whatever, and they would ask questions, you know, they'd be asking about the birds, or they'd be asking about the sky, why is the sky blue, or, you know, they'd be asking about economic systems, all sorts of questions. You know what kids are like, they come up with these questions. So obviously every time we had a conversation answering any of their questions, they were learning, and I made a a mental note to remember those, like the key conversations where I thought, wow, this is really cool. We're really going into some detail on this particular topic, because all of that is conversational learning. So just having a couple of those phrases, a couple of those terms was really helpful. And also thinking about observing what sort of style of learning your child really enjoys. So for example, you know, do they like just to talk about stuff or listen to things? You know, do they like listening to audio books or music, or, you know, are they, if they're focused on listening and talking, they might be auditory learners. So they're learning most clearly by listening, or they might be really hands-on, you know, in the sand pit, building with Lego, running around, active. They might be kinesthetic learners, so learning through doing and moving. Or they might like to watch stuff and watch YouTube videos or create images and artwork. So they might be visual learners. Or they might just want to do their own thing, which you could call a autodidactic approach or self-directed learning. So these sort of terms I found quite useful as a way of demonstrating that I had been observing my child, and I'd been observing how they were learning, and I had some understanding of, you know, it made it sound a little bit more professional or whatever. You don't need any of that stuff, but in my case, I just wanted to be confident that I was sounding like I knew what I was talking about, which is basically what they're looking for when they come and register you. They want to see confidence. They want to see somebody who's like, yep, we're fine, we're doing lots of stuff and I can talk about it confidently. So the next thing that was important for me in terms of like adapting the teaching program to the level of achievement and needs of my child was to be really honest about where they were actually up to in their different aspects of learning. And this is sort of one of the important aspects of like deschooling for me, was not trying to fit them into the box of saying they have to be at stage 3 in all their subjects, or, you know, they're trying to think of it in terms of, oh, they're in grade 2, so what should they be doing in grade 2? Basically, if you're home educating, you can be teaching your child right across the curriculum, no matter what age they're at. So, I mean, in New South Wales, we can actually just register a child for primary studies or secondary studies. And that's what I did. I'm not sure whether you can do that in other states, but even if you can't just say we're doing primary studies, there's no legal requirement that you actually just teach 1 year or 1 stage to your child. So why this is important is, well, in my case, my children were spread out literally over the whole of the primary school curriculum. And partly that was because they were very late readers. So while at a time when we were getting registered, you know, I could be comfortably having conversations with my eldest child about, you know, various physics concepts, and we were doing cool experiments, and he was listening to really amazing sort of fantasy and science fiction audio books, and there was all sorts of stuff going on, but he couldn't read at all, or only a few words, and he didn't write either. So in terms of his progress with the different key learning areas, I could say with confidence, you know, that in science he had lots of knowledge and skills, and, you know, I could tick heaps of boxes in science, and I could tick quite a few boxes in maths, but in English, I had to go right through the whole curriculum and say, well, no, reading and writing, he's back in stage 1. Like, he's like kindergarten level. But in terms of his ability to communicate, like via conversation, and to comprehend what he's hearing and talking about and absorbing, he's, you know, possibly ahead of his stage level. So I was actually really honest about that when I went for registration, and I basically had the like stage statements, which are the summaries of the learning in each key learning area for each stage. And I would say, like, I had a little highlighter and I say, oh, he's back here in stage 1 for this, and he's at stage 2 here, and he's at stage 4 here, and I would just highlight exactly where he was at. And the benefit of this was that I didn't have to get stressed about basically lying or forging, you know, stuff for registration. Like, I know quite a few parents who have fallen into, it's a little bit of a trap of feeling bad that their child isn't, you know, up to their grade level, and basically lying and saying, oh, they're doing stage 3 maths or whatever, when they weren't. And the problem is, you actually have to provide some samples of work and some documentation that your child has produced. But if you've lied and said they're up to stage 3 when they're actually back at stage 2 or stage 1, then you basically have to create you have to forge the documentation, you know, of their samples of work to demonstrate that. So it's a bit of a pit to fall into, but I know people who've fallen into it, and then had to somehow work out what to do next. So by being honest about where my children were actually at, I mean, I had to get my ego out of the way, but I could actually provide samples of work which demonstrated, yes, that they were at all these different places across the primary school curriculum. And that went right through into high school as well. And I think the key for me as well was to demonstrate that I knew where they were at in their learning, and I was providing resources that met them where they're at, you know, that were appropriate for their particular needs. And that's how I demonstrated that my teaching program, or the program that I was providing, was adapted to their needs. Because, you know, if they were, when they were, you know, still in the process of learning to read, I could show I had resources that were appropriate for their level of reading, even though, you know, they were much older than would normally be, you know, attached to those sort of resources. So the next thing to focus on for me was really observing what my children were actually learning. And to do this, I got right in and played with them. I mean, they wanted me to do that anyway, but when I was playing with them, when I was involved with helping them figure out how to play this particular video game, or, you know, mucking around, helping them build Lego, or we were on outings or whatever it was, I got as involved as possible. I watched, you know, things with them. I watched them play games. I watched sort of alongside them, with the thought in my mind to observe what they were learning while I was involved in their play. And obviously, to continue to do that right through into high school, it really helps if you have a trusting and respectful and open relationship with your child, so that they actually want you to be involved and they want to share with you what they're learning, because it's actually very important for you to have those conversations with your child so that you can figure out what's actually going on, what they are learning, because you're not necessarily going to have, you know, workbook progress that you can show. So if you're relying on conversational learning or understanding what they're actually getting up to in various video games, for example, then it really helps if they're willing to share exactly what they're up to, so you can actually see what they're learning in that process. So then the process of translating what your child is doing into the language of the curriculum is sort of the heart of the process of getting registered. And this requires a bit of practice, to be honest, and it helps to be fairly familiar with the syllabus documents. I mean, I actually went out and bought the syllabus documents. You can get them all online, and you can also buy them, although it's a bit of an investment. I knew I was going to need them for years, so I was willing to buy them, and then I could actually sit down and essentially read what the teachers are reading and get a really good idea of what the curriculum covers. So when I saw my child developing a particular skill or talking about a particular topic or getting interested in this, that, or the other, I could basically think, oh, okay, I remember that's in the personal development curriculum, or that's covered in the science curriculum. And, you know, just, you don't have to get really into detail, but the more you know what the curriculum covers, the easier it is for you to work out how to tick the boxes. And I must admit that it wasn't easy reading those syllabus documents. I don't know whether any of you have actually had a look at the Australian curriculum. The English curriculum in particular was incredibly hard to understand. I mean, I've got, you know, a couple of university degrees, and I still couldn't work out what the hell it was talking about most of the time. So I found it really frustrating. You know, there's a massive like glossary of terms in the English syllabus, and I had to use it constantly to try and figure out what the hell they were talking about in the English curriculum. Anyway, that was an interesting and rather frustrating process, and I had to get some help, you know, to really, you know, I had a group of friends and we helped each other figure out how we were going to translate what our children were doing into ticking the boxes of this, you know, saying, well, they've reached this outcome, or they've done this level of stage 4 or whatever. But just to give you an example of how any sort of thing that you might get up to in your day can end up ticking a whole lot of boxes in a syllabus document. So, for example, if you do cooking with your child, and it could be cooking anything, you know, cook a batch of muffins, or they're helping you with dinner, or you're making pancakes or whatever, that's potentially covering a whole lot of KLAs, the key learning areas. So it's almost certainly covering some aspects of the English curriculum. You might be reading a recipe, they're following instructions. There's probably maths, obviously, with cooking. You're measuring things, you're probably doing fractions, you're doing some sort of calculations. There's some science usually involved in terms of, you know, talking about liquids and solids and combining different compounds and different reactions, you know, why you use baking soda, for example, or baking powder. There's, you know, all sorts of interesting chemistry in there. There's technology. You're using, there's food technology, which goes into the whole question of where the ingredients are sourced, how they're produced, the process and technology of actually producing the food. There might be IT, information technology involved if you're actually looking up recipes on the internet or researching different cooking methods. And of course, there can be a creative arts element in there too. If one of my friends really loved to build gingerbread houses with her sons, and they ended up designing their own gingerbread houses and setting out, you know, the templates and measuring them, all sorts of maths, and there was this beautiful like 3D design in gingerbread came out of it. So that's ticking a whole lot of different key learning areas in cooking, and that's just an example that's quite easy to see how a lot of learning can be taking place. But you can basically do that with any of the activities that your child would be doing. So whether they're playing video games, whether they're watching YouTube, whether they're out in the garden playing with their pets, or whether they're actually pursuing their academic interests or their sporting interests or whatever. There's ways of actually translating that into the different KLAs. I've put a link in the course document to a Facebook group that's specifically dedicated to helping parents, unschooling parents, figure out what their kids are learning when they're doing a particular activity. So you can describe the activity that your child is doing, and parents will leap in and tell you how that's covering different key learning areas. So there is help available in the process of doing this, translating into educational language, which is essentially what the process is. So that's a really key part of this whole unschooling and being registered process, is learning how to translate everyday life into educational language. And it's a bit of a learning curve for parents to go through that. I admit it was quite a bit of work for me to provide the documentation, but it was so worth it, because basically we got registered and we just kept doing what we wanted to do. We just did whatever we wanted and it was fine. So it was really, really worth the effort for me to go through that process. So the other aspect of going through that process is recording the learning. And that involved taking a lot of photos, because in my son's case, there was hardly any written work. So I took a lot of photos. I made digital recordings. So I had audio recordings of conversations and stories they'd told. I took screenshots of stuff they did on the computer. I took videos of things that they'd done on the computer. I kept a diary of conversations we had. You know, I only did it, you know, once every few days or a week or so, you know, just to make a diary notes of the sort of conversations that we'd had that involved a lot of question and answer. And I also kept whatever little bits and pieces they produced that I might be able to use as samples of work. So if they wrote anything down, I kept it. If they drew any pictures, if I, you know, we were sitting down and I was explaining something and writing it down, an explanation, and they might have, you know, we might have done that together, then I kept a file of that. Also stuff that they'd typed, drawn, a lot of that, yeah. And there was the craft and all that sort of stuff that I kept as well. And I will admit that in the lead up to registration, I was quite willing to ask my sons if they would produce a few more samples of work for the purpose of showing the inspector. And they were fine with that. I mean, you only ever required to produce a sample. So that might just mean, you know, half a page of handwriting, or 1 or 2 pages out of a maths workbook, or just write down, you know, how you're going to work this sum out, or something like that. Literally, they were sort of a few scraps, really. Extended a little bit more as they went on. You know, it might be a whole page or a couple of pages, but they were willing to do that, because I said, look, we need some samples. I've got some stuff, I need a few more. And they just basically sat down and did it for me, because they understood that that was what we needed to get through this hoop. So I made a request and they were happy to cooperate. So lastly, you need to have a plan. And this sort of can be a bit more time consuming. I've put in the course document the examples of some samples of a plan for English and maths. And these show the sort of language that I used to demonstrate that I was providing this educational program. I really went overboard. I produced a lot more detail than pretty much anybody else I know in the homeschool community, partly because, well, mostly because my kids were such like late readers and writers. I really felt I needed to demonstrate in depth what their learning process, in order to feel confident that we would get registered. So what I'm going to do is I'll just get the English program up on the screen as an example, and I'll just, let me see. Okay, it should come up in a minute. Not that. Okay, so can you see that on your screen now? Yep. So this shows, this shows how I basically broke the English plan down into the different elements of the English curriculum. Rather than just have it all, you know, lumped together, I broke it down into writing and composing texts. And as you can see, I put the actual stage. This was for one of my children. I can't remember which one. So I wrote the stage. So he was at stage 2 and 3 for writing and composing of text. And I said things like that we focused on the pleasures of writing. We engaged in joint and independent constructions of a range of text types. And in case you're wondering how you could ever, you know, get that sort of language, I took it straight out of the syllabus document. So I basically had the syllabus document there, And I thought, how am I going to say that we're like, you know, we're sitting down and writing? And I said, oh, okay, they're describing it as engaging in joint and independent constructions. So I basically just cannibalized the language of the syllabus document to make it sound educational. I said we were writing about things including character dialogue for computer games, comics. We did shared writing. So I did, they dictated a lot to me and I would write it down. So I called that shared writing. We created text together, write simple words and sentences, begins to use computer to write sentences, improves handwriting. So that was then learning to read. You can see he was just at stage 1 and 2 for that. So we were actually just focusing on sight words. Environmental reading was a really useful term. That basically means reading things around you, stop signs and signs in shops and street signs and all that sort of stuff, just random words in the environment. We did shared reading, which means, you know, I read a bit, he read a couple of words. We had resources available for phonics instruction. So part of my educational program was to basically have a whole pile of workbooks sitting there in case we wanted to use them, which we hardly ever did until much later. But basically I was offering, we've got these books here, I can teach you out of this book if you're interested. So I included, you know, we played games. We played games with cards and board games and computer games, and we researched with books and the internet, and we used illustrations to make predictions when reading, and all these sort of stuff that I basically got out of the syllabus document. So part of the English curriculum means listening to and responding to texts. So this again was, I had a higher level, stage 2 and 3, because both of my sons were really quite good at listening to and responding to texts. They just were, it took them quite a long time to learn how to read the texts. So I won't go into all the detail here, but I just want to show you at the end, I've got a whole list of resources. So I think it's important, and the homeschool inspectors wanted to see a really solid list of resources. Like, what are you offering your child? What have you got available? And we had heaps of stuff. You know, we had heaps of books. We had heaps of workbooks. We had, but just conversations with a wide range of people in different contexts is important. So saying, yes, we have a lot of conversations with people in the extended family, in homeschool groups, in museums and on outings and things like that. I read aloud to them. So yeah, but I also included all the things that they were actually doing, like watching television, watching movies, visiting the library, reading signs, drawing and writing comic illustrations, and all of those things were included in our resources for the English curriculum. So this just gives you an example of how I did the plan for English, and I basically did the same in less detail for every subject. I did quite a bit of detail for the maths because there's lots of different aspects of maths that I wanted to demonstrate we were, you know, covering them at some level. And for some of the subjects, I actually, you know, did like a bit of a collage of photos just to demonstrate the range of different activities that we'd been doing. So all this was produced and documented at a time when my sons were playing video games for most of every day. And yet, in that process of playing video games for most of every day, all of that other learning was actually, all of that learning was taking place. So it was actually a really interesting exercise in some ways. In retrospect, you know, at the time I thought it was rather stressful, but once I actually went through that process of documenting all the learning that was actually taking place, it was actually really it was really interesting for me to realize how much was going on, and to see the learning sort of developing over time in a purely sort of self-directed and play-based sort of way. So it was really fascinating, and I actually came to enjoy the process of registration once I had got over my fear of the authorities and the fear that we would not, you know, pass. It actually became, it was difficult, you know, in terms of the amount of work involved, getting all these folders of information together, but it was actually a very satisfying process. And we did have a very supportive inspector, authorised person, come to visit us. So he was an ex-primary school headmaster, retired, and over a period of was sort of like almost 10 years that we were going through this process, he learned a lot about natural learning. And I never actually called it unschooling, what we were doing, because I didn't think he would really understand that. But he came to understand the sort of natural learning process and the process that we were going through. And he was actually very supportive. It was sort of like a mutually beneficial exercise for us. So I think that's about all I can think of to say right now, and I've talked for quite a long time. So what I will do now is invite some questions. So just unmute. Actually, I'll unmute everybody. Oh, you, let me see. How do I do that? There we go. So I'll unmute everybody. If you want to be muted again, that's fine. But if you would like to ask a question, just pipe up or wave or whatever.
I've got a question.
Yep.
So with all your photos and things that you took to document, how did you like print them all out? I know people sort of do different things with them, and I'm still a bit confused as to, because I've ended up with heaps and heaps of photos, actually how to present them or what to do with them.
Yeah. Well, what I did was I actually sort of made a selection of photos that were relevant to each key learning area.
Okay, yep.
So I sort of, I created a little, like a poster for each key learning area. And I just pasted, you know, maybe about 5 or 6 photos that were relevant to that.
Yep.
So I had one for science, and I didn't have one for every subject, but I usually had one for history and one for science and one for physical education. So I would just give a very small selection of photos that are relevant to each KLA, because otherwise it just would have, you know, overwhelmed.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. There's so many of them. Like, what do I do?
And my friends did pretty much the same thing.
Yep.
Print out a few. Although I did have a friend who did almost all her documentation by photos, and she would like present a slideshow for the inspector, which he didn't really want to see all of it. And in fact, my experience was that the inspector didn't really want to see much of the documentation at all. Yep. He would basically just want to see that it was there and have a flick through, but basically he just wanted to sit and talk and find out, you know, if everything was going fine.
Yeah, okay, cool. Thank you.
That's fine. Any other questions? Where are you sort of all up to with the registration? Is that something that's actually been a concern, or is it not a problem?
I'm a bit stressed about mine.
Who was this, Karen?
Oh, Karen, yeah. Only because we've only been doing it for nearly 2 years, not quite. So we signed up to a curriculum because my kids had been at school. Yeah. My son up until grade 5. So we bought a curriculum so that person actually wrote the plan for me. Yep. Because I had no idea what I was supposed to do. We kind of jumped into it. And then the last one I did on my own, but because we were still doing the same curriculum, I could pretty much just change a few of the words around for what she'd done. So my next one will be coming up in the next month. So it was a bit, because it's a total change now. It's a bit daunting. Yeah. Well, you probably still can use the one that they, use the language of that anyway. And just adapt it, because my experience is it's really just getting a handle on the language and then pulling out the bits that are relevant to what your kids are actually doing. Yeah. So it's probably quite helpful to have that. Yeah. And with the plan as well, it's really important to remember that, well, in New South Wales at least, they never actually ask if you followed the plan. Like, you've got to have a plan, but they don't come back and say, well, we want to see how you followed this plan. Right. No, they come back and they say, well, what's been happening? Where's your child up to? What are they learning? So they want to report that there's been some progress. Yeah. You know, that your child is actually progressing in their learning, but they never ask whether you actually followed the plan. Yep. So I would produce these incredibly detailed plans about what we were going to do. Yeah. And as soon as the homeschool inspector walked out the door, I'd just file them and and forget about them until the next time came around, when I hauled them out and I thought, okay, which bits of this did we actually do? And we did a bit of that and a bit of that and a bit of that. And then we went off in this tangent altogether. Yeah. So I would document what we had actually been doing, and inspection, and the old plan just got shelved. It was no longer relevant. But I used it to sort of cobble together, the next one, which again got shown and then filed away. So that makes sense. You don't have to really, you have to produce it, but you don't have to worry about actually following it. No. Yeah, okay. It's very important to know that. Yes. Yeah. Cool. So Fiona, did you have a question?
I was just going to comment very similar to what Karen said. We went and purchased kind of a I don't know, I guess the curriculum and the work, and it was all kind of set out kind of thing. And I did the same thing. I just kind of commented for both of my children how I was going to, I guess, assist them and, what kind of extra things we were gonna do, you know, going to the library or the museums, or how I was going to help them achieve those things, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I got through it, because I did not know how I was going to do it. I just looked at it and thought, oh my gosh, I can't do this.
Yeah.
And I just bought it, and, you know, a bunch of teachers kind of did it, and I just added my comments, and it took me a couple of nights to do that. And I thought that was, you know, it took quite a bit to read it and understand it and get your head around it. It was good, like it was helpful, but I can't imagine doing that whole thing by myself. But maybe I'm just new, and I don't know, like listening to what you're saying and what you've gone through, I don't know how I could do all that. Like, and I don't know, maybe, I don't know, like, I just don't know how I could possibly do all that.
Well, I got help. You know, I had a group of friends. We sort of went through this process together. You know, we were sort of like sharing information with each other about, okay, our kids are doing this, you know, how do we describe this, what they're doing in terms of these different key learning areas. So we sort of figured it out together, and that's why I wanted to give some examples, you know, from the English and maths. And again, I've got quite a lot of detail there, but it can give you some ideas of how you could do it if you wanted to. But yeah, it's sort of like, for some people it's easier to have a curriculum that's there, and, you know, to work out bits that you're actually going to use. But for me, since my kids were actually never even approached a formal curriculum, I basically, you know, started from scratch and said, well, this is what they're actually doing. How do I write that up as an educational program? So I just want people to know that it's possible. I know it's challenging, and that's why, you know, I'd suggest Facebook groups and groups like this, you know, where you can actually ask questions to figure out how you would do it. But it doesn't need to have the sort of detail that I put in mine to pass. You know, it can basically just be a page for each key learning area saying, you know, this is what they've been learning for science, or this is what they've been learning for history. And if you put some resources and you put some of this educational language in that particular page, it'll be fine. So don't feel like you have to start from scratch if you've actually got a curriculum that you can work for. I just wanted to give the example of what I've done, so people know that they don't have to buy a curriculum. They don't have to think that they're supposed to be doing all of this curriculum stuff when you don't actually have to. So I wanted people to know that there is a really viable option there to just never buy a curriculum and never be concerned that your child isn't following the curriculum, because it's possible to just observe what they're actually learning, translate that, tick the boxes, and off you go.
Yeah.
So I'm not presenting this as anything that, you know, is supposed to feel daunting. It's just there in case you want that option.
Yeah, I understand. I guess in terms of, so for my son, who sounds very similar to your son's, he did go to school but didn't particularly like it, and loves his gaming, of course. With him, it's been the trickiest. So what I've tended to do most of the time is touch on what we need to touch on each week, and the bits that he really wants to dive into let him dive into. Usually each week there's one part that, you know, needs to be kind of kept and assessed. And so, and I emphasize that to him. I mean, he's nearly 12, so I can communicate that with him and say, okay, when they come and look at us, they're going to see this piece of paper. So, you know, try and do it as clearly as possible and try and make it neat. Make sure you finish it, and let's get some, you know, some other things and pictures and stuff like that. So, just say, so that's what I've kind of done. And then if something comes up that I think's just really inappropriate, or I think, oh my gosh, this is just so not at his level, I've just tried to find something else, or we've just had discussions around it, or we've just gone to YouTube, and then I've just documented the changes that I've made, like stuff like that. So I guess it's helpful in what you're saying, in that it's given me lots of ideas on how I can do that part of it. The changing of bits that I think that there's no way I can sit down and get him to do that, or, you know, I just, you know, there's parts of it that I feel really pointless, you know, and that I've thought, well, we'll have an open discussion about it, and I'll make some notes, but I don't actually get them to do the worksheets, because I think, oh my gosh, that's going to be harder for me to get them to do the worksheets. You know, I'm pretty much doing them myself. So we might as well just have a conversation around it, and I make some notes, and then we move on, kind of thing. So I guess it's, we've kind of adapted that way. So
that's cool. And actually, you're just having those conversations is very similar to what I was doing, and writing a diary of conversations. I was, probably the difference is I wasn't prompting the conversations based on a curriculum. I was just getting asked random stuff, you know, that they were interested in. And it was actually really interesting to see how we ended up covering the curriculum anyway, you know, just in the questions that they asked. Only if you zoom out, you know, if you zoom out over years, then then a huge amount of that curriculum is covered just in the process of living life and being curious about stuff and having lots of conversations and playing and all that sort of stuff. It's just really interesting how much you actually cover anyway. So I guess my message is, it's okay to relax around trying to, you know, cover the formal curriculum, because your children are going to get there anyway. You know, they're going to cover it over a period of time in some way. And if you document that, then you can meet your legal requirements that way. But by all means, you know, do whatever works for your family. If it's working and your child is willing to, you know, to go along with that plan, at least to some extent, it sounds like, you know, you're working together with him and it's going fine. Yeah. So, I mean, there might be some more ideas, I think, in the maths document as well, specifically relating to the maths that my sons were doing in various video games. So that might give you a few more ideas. There's so much going on in video games. So the more you can actually, and you sounds like you're already doing this, but the more you're noticing what your son is learning in those video games, the more you can relax about, you know, needing to cover the formal curriculum, because you will see that he's already actually covering it, or at least some of it, when he's playing. So that can sort of start to take over if that's the direction that he is most comfortable with. But, you know, it sounds like you've worked out a nice balance with him anyway.
Yeah, we've tried. I guess I've negotiated. I feel like I've negotiated with him a balance
Yeah.
of okay, this is what I need to do for you to not have to go to school. So you need to do this little bit for me.
Yeah.
And then we can continue doing what we're doing. So
Yeah.
did you have did you give them time limits and stuff on their gaming? You know, if they wanted to get up and start gaming at 7 o'clock and game for 12 hours straight or something crazy like that, did you find that they had times where they just wanted to do it constantly? Did you find you had to pull them away from it, direct them in different areas? We have to go and do this. Did you get a lot of resistance with that kind of thing?
I didn't ever put limits on it, so I didn't have resistance. And yes, there were many days when they got up and started gaming and played all day and then went to bed and got up and did the same the day after. And sometimes I would say, oh, you know, it'd be really cool, you know, we should go out and go to the park or whatever. I mean, they were always fine with going to see friends or go out on a excursion or, you know, all that sort of stuff that they enjoyed. They had no problem getting off the gaming to do stuff that they wanted to do. And basically I didn't limit them. So we just went with it. And that's why it was so important for me to be involved with what they were doing, so I could see how much they were actually learning in those days, you know, when they were gaming all day. And I could actually celebrate how much they were learning in that time, you know, and I could see, wow, today they've been in Minecraft for 10 hours or whatever, but they've built this incredible city, and they've been working with their friends to create a monetary economy, and they've been trading, and they've been writing signs and building shops and designing circuits and, you know, whatever crazy things they were actually up to. I was actually right there seeing what they were doing. So it was really amazing to see what was actually going on in those games. So once I was really fully involved, I didn't feel any need to pull them away, because it was really amazing what they were actually doing. I did occasionally suggest that they might like a break to go and, you know, jump on the trampoline or stretch their legs, or, you know, I did make suggestions like that. But they were suggestions, you know, like, okay, wouldn't you like to have a break, have some food, have a run around the park or something, or jumping up and down in the back garden, and most of the time they were fine, you know, to go with those suggestions. But that's pretty much the extent of it. Yeah.
And what about in terms of chores, like around the house and things like that? Did they have those responsibilities?
No. No chores. I would ask them to help when I wanted help. You know, come and help me do some gardening, or can we tidy up this room? Can you pick up the stuff pick up all the Lego off the floor, or whatever? And most of the time they would help, or they would say, no, I'm not getting up, I'm not helping. Basically, I relied on their self-motivation to cooperate when they wanted to, and it worked out fine. I mean, I did a lot of the housework for a lot of time, and then when they got to an age when they started focusing on their environment and the order of their environment, they started doing more of it themselves. So they started, you know, cleaning their room and tidying up, because they started noticing it was a mess. And it sort of came at a certain age, you know, once they got to their teens, early teens, they started like oh, I actually really want to clean this space. So it sort of developed naturally, an interest in order and tidiness to some extent. Obviously, it varies for different personalities. One son got super into cleaning and vacuumed the house and vacuumed his room and tidied everything up, and the other son didn't really mind living in a bit of a pigsty for most of the time in his room, but then would just like do this big blitz and clean it all up and get it all beautiful and then just let it go into a big mess again. That was just his personality. So yeah, that's how I handled it. And you know, different families have very different approaches to that issue.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Okay.
it worked out well for us to do it that way.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Okay. Does anybody else have any questions? Nope. No questions? Okay, well, thank you very much for your participation, and I look forward to seeing you again next week, where we will be talking about any issues that you have relating to that are causing any stress or worry, and I will be sort of introducing the process that I use to unlearn the things that were really stressing me out, and I'll share some of that journey with you. So I look forward to seeing you then. So good night.
Thank you.
Good night. See ya.
Bye.